because then they want to wield the power of the institution in order to have an impact on society or to message people about things that are nothing to do with it. So, for instance, to the extent that collectivized instincts encouraged footballers to take the knee before games in the Premier League. Well, maybe some footballers felt that Black Lives Matter was a viable and valid and a message that needed to get out there, but maybe some of them didn't, and maybe some of the fans did, and maybe some of the fans didn't. But as soon as they're having it shoved down their throats, that creates a problem. If you've gone to see a football match and instead it's been co-opted by a political organization of any kind, and again, I don't think it's been a coordinated effort, and yet, the incontrovertibly has happened. You see it again and again and again.
Thank you so much for joining me. I know you're really busy and you have a really busy touring schedule. Are you touring now?
I've been touring the same show, would you believe, since August of 2019, with obvious interruptions and postponements. And then second postponement, some of my shows were postponed due to COVID, then due to the second lockdown, and then postponed a third time due to the royal funeral. People of Winchester had to really keep track of their emails, but they got there in the end.
Yeah, I know the feeling. I was like, I almost had my own show. I was supposed to do this big tour, and then lockdown came, and I was like, yeah, this is my moment. I'm really going to take off. And then it was not meant to be.
It's still meant to be. You're very young. You have the whole world is opening up constantly. I think there is a temptation, genuinely, in the media world to assume that you have missed the boat again and again and again. When I think of all the boats I think I've missed, whether it be podcasting or having a YouTube channel or creating an online avatar of some kind, but actually these things just constantly unfold, and there are always new opportunities to jump on and get to work.
Yeah, I feel like media is really like that. There's always these fits and starts. You get so hopeful. The very first thing I did when I first moved to the UK was a show with Jack Whitehall and Richard Ayoade, and I didn't even know who these people were. And it wasn't until I was literally on the stage and they were introducing everyone. And they were like, eminent scholar, blah, 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 comedian who's been, and I was like, oh my God. And then it got to me. And it's like, here's Ashley. She's on Twitter.
Jack Whitehall blew up very quickly. I mean, I remember not very long ago phoning him up when we were on a bill together in a comedy club, and just saying, would you mind if you went on in the middle? Because I'm going to get there late and I'd like to close. And he was like, I think they're kind of expecting me to close, Simon. I had genuinely not registered that he was like orders of magnitude bigger than me. And I was like filling in for him. I was like, okay, fine, Jack, and you get to the auditorium, there's like screaming girls fainting outside the stage door, but including.
But one of the things about Jack Whitehall was, and I'm going to reveal my incredible stupidity here, and I hope that you'll be kind to me, but this was like 10 years ago. I was really young. I was fresh out of my PhD, and I was like, oh, these are comedians. They're so funny, like when the camera's rolling. And I was actually shocked when the camera stopped rolling, how incredibly serious they were. And it was just like, straight faced out of nowhere. Do you ever get that kind of where people kind of typecast you, expect you to be really silly and don't take you seriously because of that?
Well, I think every different comedian that I know has a different degree of on-off switch, and there are some who remain on the whole time, or at least have always been on in my presence, and that can be exhausting. And actually, I think it is more natural, to be honest, to be to just dial it down a bit when the cameras stop rolling and the microphones are off. I have a tendency, if anything, and I am sort of aware of it, and if I objectively, I don't know that it's that attractive, but I have a tendency to try and demonstrate on camera, on microphone, like I am now, that I'm sort of thoughtful and I guess kind of multi-talented or polymathic or whatever. I would much rather people thought of me as a kind of Brian Eno or a Clive James, one of these people who can work in different modes and at different levels, rather than a comedian. But of course, that's not why they're booking you as a rule. You have generally been booked in order to make people laugh. So you have to kind of play that game a little bit. I think there's a general understanding now with social media and so on that I think that was something, there was a bit of a rude awakening about 10, 15 years ago when Twitter first started, that the number of comedians who were on there and their fans all signed up, and some of them, of course, just used a platform for advertising gig schedules, but some of them went straight into social justice mode. You know, Graham Linehan, who of course has since been on a very much longer and more bumpy journey on that front, which is I find really interesting in itself. But he was like quite a sort of left liberal scold for quite a while. Almost all of his Twitter output was about internet, control. Who was going to have? There was a lot of talk. I can't remember exactly what the terms that we used, but in about 2010, 2011, there were rumblings that the internet was going to become a much more regulated neighborhood, and that was all his preoccupation. And anyone who went on there thinking, oh, this is the fella off Father Ted, this will be a crack, they were like very quickly awakened to the reality of it. Hardly any comedians that I know are the life and soul of the party, to be truthful. I think a lot of comedians, and I would include myself, become comedians because they like being funny. They like to be appreciated and understood to be funny. They like getting laughs. And they've actually been denied that in the general kind of run of play in social gatherings and so on, because there are other people who are funnier, so they kind of go, right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a stage, lighting rig, microphone, amplifier. I'm going to have everyone sat down in the dark and then they will have to listen to me,
Yeah, I feel like that's how I became an academic. Like I wanted to be like a public speaker. I want to be a public intellectual. I just wanted people to like be in an audience and be in awe, because my whole life I talk too much. That's my thing. I just talk endlessly. And so I was like, well, I better study to have something to talk about. And I better go become a lecturer so people are forced to sit and listen.
It's perfectly reasonable. I think as long as you recognize it, it's a very human need, isn't it? And we've all realized that. That's what social media has taught us, right? Is that everybody wants to talk, Did you know Milan Kundera, a Czech novelist from like the 80s? I guess it was at his height. Well, I say Czech, he was Czech and living in France, I think, but wrote about sort of, the oppressive regimes and so on in Eastern Europe. There's a great, but I think it's in the book of Laughter and Forgetting, when he talks about all the emus that rush up to see him in the zoo and just like talk at him through the chain link fence. And how he's just suddenly realizes this is what everyone's like. They're just yakking all the time and nobody's listening, and emus
It's like
are like
literal
that.
Twitter.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But yeah, getting a PhD, getting a show in Edinburgh, all these things are just ways, they're like flexing, aren't they? It's sexual signaling, according to Geoffrey Miller. I think there's probably some truth to it.
It's funny because I was just reading this sort of exchange between people the other day, and it was about catcalling or something stupid. And this one of the commentators was like, oh, well, men just find it so hard to imagine that women don't need external validation for who they are. And I was like, what bullshit? Because yeah, of course you need external validation for who you are. By virtue of being a human, you don't walk out of the womb like extolling the virtues of the free market or whatever. You are, more or less a blank slate, and you grow into who you are as a basis of interacting with other people, seeing how other people respond to you, and changing and adapting as a result of that. Especially when it comes to like sexual desire. Like, I'm sorry, I need to know. I need to get some feedback here.
How is this playing? Yeah. Yeah, absolutely agree with you. And not that everything is sexual signaling, but almost everything that isn't simply fulfilling a basic biological need, there's an element of that, isn't it? There's an argument, the whole of culture, from the peacock's tail argument is that is what we're doing, demonstrating we have excess capacity, we have excess intelligence and energy and so on, and that we can use in order to flourish, And,
or at the very least, once our needs are met, then that becomes more of a preoccupation.
Peterson, I think, was good on that. And I always found it interesting to look back when I heard him saying that, that a lot of what he argues for in terms of sexual and gender politics and so on is the recognition that we are all the product of an ongoing negotiation with society. We do not get to choose unilaterally who we are. We have to accept that other people have some right to kind of contest that, or at least they do if they're intending to stick around. They can just leave. You can be who you are on your own, but if you want to play, that's what play is, right? That's play is an ongoing negotiation to create a fictional universe. The social construct doesn't mean it isn't real. It just means it's a consensus.
Yeah, absolutely. And I, as someone who actually uses social constructionism, I use social constructionism in my own work. And the thing that annoys me is that it reminds me of when I very first started teaching at a university. I was teaching social constructionism, and I had to like unteach a ton of really bad social constructionism, where it was like everything I don't like is a social construct.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
all the things that I do like, they're natural. They're not social
yeah, yeah.
constructs. And I think the basic misunderstanding is what you get in the cultural sphere now, where it's like, oh, well, all of these things are social constructs, but
Yeah.
my thing isn't,
Douglas Murray was good on that in The Madness of Crowds, talking about the shifting concept we have of gender and sexual orientation. And obviously, as a gay man, as well as a right leaning academic, he was in an unusual situation in terms of being able to discuss that, to having a pass, I guess, to what might have appeared otherwise problematic. But I found it very interesting how he was saying, like, at certain points politically, it is more beneficial, it's more helpful to a certain movement, to an activism or whatever, to present personality or behavioral traits as baked in, hardwired, and other times to present them as social constructs or moot or adaptable. It helps to explain your determination to enjoy equal rights or whatever, and it's very interesting how that is in itself a fluid thing. The idea of social construction is in itself almost a social construct, or at least what that means, what that term means. But then again, I don't think we're doing badly. I do think this is it is a kind of it's a sociological or whatever, Judith Butler and all the rest of it, but it is something that just used to exist in academia until not long ago, and now a lot of ordinary people and my own daughter and stuff use those terms, even if they don't use them exactly correctly. The fact that they're aware that these things are up for debate or that there is a language for discussing them, I think that's probably progress of a kind.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the issue is that people are still searching for some firm grounding for truth that isn't in human judgment,
Yeah.
right? Like everything's a social construct, right? But what does that mean? It's basically a stupid thing to say, because yes, but we have to decide, we have to make a judgment on what constructs we're going to live our lives by.
Yeah.
We have to decide what constructs make it easier to live together, and that requires consensus, some bargaining, negotiation. Ideally, in a democratic society, that's what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. And even then, I mean, not just in a democratic society, but actually, in a way, even in under a monarchy or anything, there are certain rules which have been demonstrated to lead to desirable outcomes, and it isn't always immediately obvious which those rules will be. When you're sitting around smoking reefers around a bonfire on the beach, reconstructing society along more egalitarian lines, it's not immediately obvious what some of the unexpected outcomes might be. So, to an extent, I think civilization at this point, although it has all kinds of things that I think are wrong with it, and I do have a kind of gnawing sense of decline, but that may just be, my age. But I do think it is also like a pebble that's been worn smooth by a couple of thousand years of ocean activity, and you have to recognize that it probably reflects, to some extent, a consensus that has been found operable, even though there are bad actors and so on who might have more interest in maintaining the status quo than others.
Can you think of an example of that? You seem to have something in mind.
Well, I mean, again, I don't want to sound like too much of a fanboy, but we seem to be in his territory. Peterson would say the patriarchy is something you have to keep an eye on. We live on a diluted version of the patriarchy by comparison with prehistoric pastoralism, where there is literally a father figure at the head of the clan, and he will mete out horrific punishments on along very autocratic lines. Nowadays, the rule of the father in most families in the UK, I think, is heavily hemmed in by law and convention. And actually, I think I would probably more easily point at what really amount to matriarchal family units that I know in Brighton. I mean, I don't mean like because I'm saying Brighton immediately people have pictures of, but like this is just where I live. I think there are more households in Brighton that I know of where the woman has an unequal level of control over the financial outlays, the values that the family observe and live by, and so on. But the patriarchy is a system that is capable of spinning out of control if it isn't constantly checked. Yeah. So what starts out as this kind of works because men need to take responsibility for their offspring. Women will have them and will naturally be bonded to them and be identified with them. And we need to have laws and conventions that make sure the fathers stick around as well. So there are certain kind of arguments for why those things work, but they can escalate and become dysfunctional. I mean, I think we have a pretty good system as they go for doing that, I guess, in the West. But sometimes you feel, as I say, I think it is probably a thing with age to some extent, because you get more nervous as you find yourself feeling like I've got less time to fix this if it goes wrong. And maybe less energy as well, and less capacity to build things up again from scratch. That's that interesting line in Kipling's poem If. There's a number, although it's a terrible old tea towel of a poem, there are a number of quite interesting propositions in there. And I think one of them about, if you can heap your winnings or heap your wealth onto a single toss of the dice and lose, and toss of the coin and lose, and start again from scratch, then you'll be a man, my son. Well, that's fine when he's talking to his 18-year-old son. That's a lot harder to stomach in your late 50s.
I think there's a tendency to see the way that certain patterns in the way that people live, and to assume that these are de facto problematic, right? So if people have patriarchal kind of relations in their own families, this is like they're duped by the patriarchy, right? And there's less of an understanding that these things can work in particular contexts, and that they can be abandoned when they don't work. Just to give my a little anecdote, but I married a very stereotypically masculine man. He's a ex-footballer. We have a very stereotypical family where he is definitely in charge.
Right.
Because I am an idiot and I will get lost in a cardboard box. I have a mind that's only for books. I require this person to leave me, and I'm fine with that. But when it didn't work, when I was the main breadwinner, he took care of our babies. He even wore one of those baby Bjorns and walked around quite proudly.
Right.
And people, when I talk about this, that my husband sees the family as something that's really important, as something worth sacrificing for, and just a really important kind of institution, I get a lot of flack, oh, you married a trad dad. The vast majority of humanity lives their life on the basis of some traditions. They give us some kind of guidance, and when they work, they work, and when they don't, people have a capacity of their own accord to abandon them. But there's this sense that without some kind of outside power to come in and tell people how to live, they're going to get things wrong. And the fact that they get things wrong is actually the root of a huge range of social problems. So a big range of policy becomes, fixing people and fixing their allegedly maladapted arrangements of just mindless going through tradition. Do you see that, or does that characterization kind of represent?
I think it's absolutely true. I mean, it's not quite the same, but it's kind of similar to the concept of anchoring, which is like a sales technique and so on, where if you say to somebody, how much do you think this car is worth? They might have no idea, but if you say it normally goes for 20,000, but I'm selling it today for 15,000, they immediately think they've got a bargain. People have a look for an anchor, and the same thing happens in morality and tradition and the way social order is organized. I mean, just as a very obvious example, if most of human history seems to have been organized around certain repeated time periods, and some of those are imposed by nature. For instance, we obviously have the seasons, and you have to, in a farming culture, you have to respect the seasons or you will come off the worst. The seasons won't get hurt, But the working week is pretty much a classic social construct, or originally a religious construct, possibly associated with certain superstitions, certain kind of beliefs that the certain numbers were mystical and were given by God and so on. But you could say 5-day working week, 1 day of sport and shopping, and then 1 day of rest, reflection, and ideally prayer or meditation or peace and tranquility in the home. That seems like a fairly workable solution to how to organize our time, but we could take another look at that now, perhaps, with the amount of sedentary work we do, or the extent to which machines have taken off, a lot of the burden or whatever. We could extend the week or we could shorten it, but we'd need to start with the week and say, maybe we could do a 7-day working week and then have a 3-day weekend. Would that work? I don't know. There's all kinds of things you could do, but you can't just start from scratch. You need to have some recognition of what has worked in the past and maybe what has grated on people. Yeah. And I do think it's interesting, again, you say, you recognize you have a traditional masculine, feminine hierarchy in the household, the confidence that you have in that and that you're both happy with it is probably what allows your husband to then say, however, since you're earning money and I'm not, I will stay home and look at the kids because I don't feel emasculated by it. I feel that we understand one another on that level and in those regards. And interestingly, I don't know whether you meant it like as it was the kind of most important part of your of how your brain architecture is organized. But I'm like you. I'm very verbal and easily lost geographically. I'm absolutely not a space rotator. And my wife is a lot better on that front. You know, she does have more. She has more instinctive diary organization. You know, she remembers what we're doing next Thursday, whereas I absolutely have to check. You know, and consequently, she's kind of in charge. You know, that does. You know, that just flows pretty naturally into who's going to take control of this stuff.
Yeah, my husband has way more maternal instinct than I do. He's like a duck to water. I was like, oh, children, babies. Oh God, there's a lot of bodily fluid to deal with. And he was just like, he didn't care. He could change a diaper and go eat a burger. He was like, he was not at all bothered. Right. So, and people are, I think, for the most part, quite dynamic. Now, that doesn't mean that, tradition can't become, as you say, like a box that can hold people back sometimes. Like there is a certain danger to wanting this kind of rules or motions to go through especially because our societies have less of that. And therefore there's less certainty about who you are. And so you do have to make those judgments about how I'm going to be, who I'm going to be, how I'm going to live in the world. And I think in the face of that kind of radical freedom that we sometimes have, there is this desire to kind of retreat back and say, no, there isn't actually any choice here. Everything is determined. I'm determined by something intrinsic to myself and who I am. And, it's not really any choice, or like, no, this is the way of the world. This is the law of the land. It's always been this way. And therefore this is how it's always going to be. So it's a tough kind of tightrope that we have to walk in modernity, I think.
And especially if you do want to make those changes, you do have to recognize that you for everything you add, you have to take something off, or vice versa. Otherwise it won't be great for you. I think my wife is certainly not alone, and maybe this reflects badly on me for like failing to pick up what she was casting off. But I don't think she's alone in feeling. We have an 18 and a 15-year-old now. She's worked pretty much throughout their schooling, but has also been an absolutely committed mum. I mean, she's been really like hands-on, and even I would say probably a little too hands-on, has not allowed them to like fail often enough, to toughen up possibly, but that'll come at some point. But as a result, it's a kind of burnout, that the idea that that you can have it all, that you can have a career and you can fulfill all the functions that a mother traditionally has, is gonna be really hard, and it's not simply a question, as I say, I give myself a little bit of a pass because it's not simply a question of going, fine, I will empty the dishwasher, I will do the cooking, I will make the beds. It's more the emotional input that you have two things to which you are absolutely committed: your career, your client. She works in the service sector, she has clients who think nothing of calling her or texting her at 11 o'clock on a Friday night, to check that interview has been lined up for the following day on Radio 4 or whatever. And also she wants to be there with her kids, or if one of them has a nightmare in the middle of the night, even now, or or sends a WhatsApp from Thailand to say, oh my God, I've eaten something, I feel wretched, and it's like, you've got to be everything. And it's not simply a question of, it's not about muscle energy, it's about how much emotional fuel you have, and that is hard, So if you break with the tradition of saying there is a breadwinner in every household and there's a homemaker, if you think I'm going to be a breadwinner too, you have to understand and embrace yourself, I think, certainly for the strain.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I feel this, but the difference too is that the expectations that are placed on parents have risen up enormously.
Yeah.
And I think this is part of that kind of determinism that I was talking about, where people will say, well, it's not me. I'm not really in control of this. It's something that my parents did, right? We have this kind of childhood determinism, parental determinism, where we're encouraged to construct a narrative of our lives that goes back to some seemingly innocuous event in our childhoods. And then this becomes the narrative that explains everything about who we are. And then as a parent, you feel that, right? Like, I'm going to say something wrong and I'm going to mess my kid up and I'm not going to be there. I'm not, you have to be everything. But at the same time, I also have to be, as being an intensive mother, an intensive parent, I also have to be an intensive worker. So I have to do these things 100%. And then anytime anything goes wrong, it's like, oh, where were the parents? Where, the
Yeah,
parents
yeah.
are the root of all evil, and this makes you quite anxious. And so you wind up playing two roles that it's not just that you have a problem with these two roles, it's that the expectations that are associated with both of these roles have also increased massively. I think that's something that people don't understand. We have like a culture of like parent bashing. There's
Yeah.
like everyone talks about hate, right? Oh, there's too much hatred in society, but it's perfectly acceptable to hate on parents. That's fine.
It seems to be human nature to expect that there will be somebody somewhere to blame, and so yeah, absolutely. Essentially, by it's trying to exonerate individuals for their failures and their deviations from the true path. We don't just kind of go, oh well, that's just the way things are. We look around for somebody else to blame, and then of course you will say, well, maybe the parents failed because they were failed in turn, and this is Larkin's poem about it, isn't it? But my view has changed over the course of my parenthood, partly from direct experiential analysis, like just like observing what is happening in front of my eyes, but also the reading that I've done, which is maybe I've read and chosen to reinforce my suspicions, which is that a lot of this stuff is baked into kids. And actually, the best way to parent is to give yourself a break as often as possible, not take responsibility for like every outcome, good or bad. To some extent, if your kids do great at school, that wasn't really your credit either. That's just, you were lucky that kid was great, because if the next one comes along and fails, that doesn't mean you did well for the first one and failed for the second one. That's just, to some extent, it's not even predictably heritable. It's not like you could pick somebody and have your genes mapped up on a chart and just go up, 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 up. That's who we're going to have. Although I think that happens to a greater extent than most people are really comfortable with acknowledging, but it's absolutely not watertight. But, I read a book recently called Innate, which explained it the best I've encountered it yet. Just the sort of random element to which even two people with great genes can get together and produce a monster, or vice versa. Carl Friedrich Gauss, I think that's his full name. Some would say the greatest mathematician since Archimedes, was born to a literally illiterate peasant family. It was almost sheer luck that he was kind of hooked out of the mud, of 17th century Germany or whatever, and able to get into university and demonstrate what he had. So it's not like this is like a direct, I'm not talking a eugenics thing. It's just simply once it happens, there's a limit, quite a significant limit, to how much good or ill you can do for your children in the long term. Much better to just enjoy parenting. Parenting can be fun. You can have games. You can teach them tricks. You can play tricks on them, and then they can play tricks on you. And you make a mess at dinner time and all that stuff. That's all great. Don't go to bed every night thinking, oh my God, I am screwing them up so badly. They're going to end up insane and it's going to be my fault. That doesn't help anyone, and it just isn't true.
Yeah, and that's, I think, the problem with this kind of parental determinism and all the brain science. And oh no, what was it? It was Oliver James. I watched like a 10-year-old interview recently, and he's like, I've got 30 studies. I got 30 neuroscientific. What studies have you got? Name one. And it was like, oh my God, that's not what family is about. It's not like when you transform family into a series of key performance indicators, which anyway is totally stupid, because it's not like you're going to solve all social problems by like going in and like making employability a key performance indicator of a family. It sucks the joy out of that relationship, and it makes it something that is drudgery and horrible. And then we wonder why like so many parents express a certain amount of unhappiness with their role, and we go, oh well, I guess you should be a parent then. No, maybe we should like grow up and stop blaming parents for everything.
I mean, the big problem we all know we're facing across the West, not just in this country, is low levels of fertility, and I suppose that it does correlate to a large extent with women going out to work and wanting to have careers and leaving it later. But I think if more women realize that they can just do a bad job and it's still fine. You know what I mean? It's like you don't have to be perfect in everything, and actually a lot of kids will grow up healthier and happier if they are given a few opportunities to, a little bit of extra space to fail in. Not saying they should be wandering the streets until 7 o'clock every night, waiting to be let in. But there is
neglect, right?
Yeah.
Honestly, I have very little. Like, people are talking about like, oh, those parents these days don't play with their children on the swing sets or whatever, and it's like,
Yeah.
what the hell are parents doing on the playthings? Like, sit back and enjoy your book, and just make sure don't hit them with a frying pan, don't lock them in a closet, but otherwise probably be fine. I have very few memories of my parents when I was growing up, and thank God for that. Like,
Absolutely.
just
I mean, my main memory is of coming back late than I was supposed to, briefly getting, scolded for having made her worry, And my mum she was perfectly capable, like all other mums were, of reading avidly in the local paper about which escaped lunatic was most likely to abduct me, from the woods. But touch wood, so far it didn't happen. And I wasn't even a particular. I mean, as I said, I have very poor, visual, spatial, cognitive abilities. I could quite easily get lost in the wood. That could have happened. But anyway, I think it's a great shame. I think we have become slightly house cats, and we are a little bit like. Afraid of our own shadow. I've seen various diagrams. I don't know how well referenced they are, but they ring true to me. Of like, every generation has this shrinking radius. It's almost like Russia and its spheres of influence. They used to have an empire, and now they're not even allowed to police their own borders. And there is that kind of sense in an 8-year-old boy in the 1930s could have been gone. For hours at a time. No parent would know where they were. They may be wandering through the country lanes, but also equally in town, and would know their way around and would hook up with other gangs or even get into scraps or whatever, and come home with a black eye and barely even register on the parents consciousness. And now 8-year-old boys are lucky, I think it's fair to say, if they're allowed out the front door on their own at all.
Yeah, and of course people will again blame parents for that and talk about helicopter parenting, but like for years and years, to be a good parent was to be aware of any and all risk and to protect your children from any and all risk. And Jenny Bristow calls this the double bind of parenting culture, where you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, right? So if you leave your children on too long a tether and something goes wrong, you're to blame. But if you don't, you're also to blame.
Well, psychologically, all 99% of parents can do is operate within quite a narrow band, that is presented to them by the other parents that they know, and to some extent their own childhood, but much more the peer group. So if you are on a street where all the other parents do have kind of gone, what the hell with this? We're going to let our kids play outside. Well, you'll probably join in. But to be the one who proactively introduces that idea that is a big risk. Yeah. Especially, as you say, if anything were to go wrong.
It's risky also, especially in the United States, like legally risky. In some places, it's just outlawed. Wow. And people have gone through terrible situations because they have tried to adopt a kind of free range parenting. It's actually the name of a movement called free range parenting.
Yes. No, yeah.
I think they're really different. I think we are much more preoccupied with our children every second of the day. Are they safe? Are they learning? Are they getting enough out of this moment, this class, this instant when we're supposed to be bonding? And we're really afraid for them all the time. And it's not just me thinking this. You get to a certain age and everybody thinks, oh, the good old days. We stayed out, we had fun, we played outside until the streetlights came on. But the proof that things really have changed in just about one generation is that if you go get the DVD of Sesame Street Old School, it's a 2-DVD set of the early days of Sesame Street, 1969 to 1974, and you see all the stuff that we sort of associate with childhood. You see kids on trikes, you see kids playing Follow the Leader, and there's no, accredited PhD trained Follow the Leader, it's just kids. You see them playing in a vacant lot and balancing on the beams and climbing through the pipes and stuff. And before you see any of that, what I consider normal childhood, my childhood, a warning appears on the screen at the very beginning. It's not a joke. And it says, the following is intended for adult viewing only. Adult viewing only. They cannot endorse a normal childhood the way they did back in 1970. That is now considered radical, crazy, dangerous, and I have a friend who's a lawyer there, and frankly, they debated it, and they were afraid of getting sued. What if, God forbid, somebody goes out and plays by himself? They weren't willing to take that risk anymore. And what I'm interested in is, why is that considered risky? Considering the crime rate back in the 70s and 80s, when most parents today were growing up and playing outside till the streetlights came on, that crime rate was higher than it is now. So if it wasn't risky then, or wasn't crazy risky, wasn't nutty parents who didn't care at all about their kids, sending their kids out and never caring whether they came home or not, if they weren't terrible, if our parents weren't terrible, why are we considered terrible if we let our children ride their bike around the neighborhood or walk to school? Really, people will scream at you if you do that with your kids.
So people will know you from lots of different things. Obviously, we've talked about how you're a comedian. You had a BBC show, Simon Evans Goes to Market, and now you're the host of Headliners. And I want to talk about Headliners, but I'm curious about the BBC show. So what made you want to bring comedy into the famously dismal science of, of economics?
Yeah. Well, it was events, of course, dear boy, as the saying goes. I talked to the producer of the first series. Her name was Talusha Galani. She's at Sky now, I think. She made one series with us and then left, and it was handed over. But I was talking to her at the Radio 4 Christmas, the entertainment Radio 4 party, just like a drinks party in the Radio Theatre in about 2009. And of course, we just had the huge crash, the credit crunch and the financial crisis. And I mean, it was a fairly banal observation, but I was saying I still don't think most people understand how banks operate. I don't think most people understand how money is created. I don't think people understand fractional reserve banking. I don't think they understand anything about credit swaps or debt obligations, or lateralized investments and how debt itself is exchanged. And they don't know what went wrong, and they don't know why it will or won't happen again. They are every bit as subject to the whims of chance as if they had been hit by an earthquake. We almost had a sort of situation like the Lisbon earthquake, which arguably was one of the great events in the creation of the change of thinking that was the Enlightenment. Rousseau and Voltaire arguing over that earthquake, and there were still people arguing over the financial crisis in the same terms, as if it was a sort of act of God which had to be understood and read like runes. So I said maybe comedy being one way of like making a subject less terrifying and less intimidating, we could make a Radio 4 comedy series about it. And just try and explain to people, what had happened and whether it was likely to happen again, and what had perhaps been some of the upsides of the deregulation that had preceded it, and whether we had actually benefited to some extent as well, and whether boom and bust is all bad. It always feels bad when you've hit bust, but that's a little bit like the hangover. You do forget during the hangover that you quite enjoyed the drink the night before, but when you get to a certain point in life, you kind of go, I have had some good nights, and actually the hangovers recede into the darker place. So anyway, that was the conversation. By the time the series actually got made in 2011, I think the first one went out, we adapted it slightly and looked more at specific commodities and about how markets had changed the way we interact, how markets had governed our relationship with the natural world generally, I suppose, and how we had organized the sale of land in this country, for instance, and who really owned it, how oil was still misunderstood, the extent which had begun then, even in 2011, the idea that we might just wean ourselves off it. And we did a series about not underestimating just quite what it is you're asking people to do there. And it became, I found it really fascinating. And so we did just 4 episodes, and I had a great sidekick, Tim Harford, who is continues to be a bit of a star on Radio 4, who talks about statistics a lot and how people misunderstand statistics as well, and how they are abused, by government and so on. And it became I think we made 6 series in the end, and it was a very interesting way of looking at the world through that particular lens. Economics is not that different actually from stand-up comedy, insofar as, or at least you can take it from that view, it is a study of human behavior, and often of behavior which can strike you if you take a step back as being a bit odd. And certainly quirky or not irrational necessarily, but it's not always obvious what the rationality is. And so it became great. But the one thing we never did discuss on the show, of course, was the credit crunch and the financial crisis. Because by the time we actually got to make it, by the time it had been commissioned, that felt like it was yesterday's news of it.
So the outlook on the show was more or less, well, God, what does this mean today? But it was kind of right wing, was it not? In the sense that you thought that markets were probably the best way of organizing things, and you had these problems, but it was something that could be worked out. Is that right?
Yeah, I would certainly, if that's your definition of right wing, I would say it was. It's a really interesting question. That is, I actually did make a single program called "Am I Right?" I think it was called, about right wing, left wing divide post Brexit, what that really meant. Whether the EU was to be considered a left-wing thing, which I don't really think it was ever. So to answer your question, was the show right-wing? I didn't feel it was right-wing. What I felt it was possibly was explaining to people the hidden mechanics of things which they might have attributed to hostile or like evil behavior. That capitalism wasn't evil. It was a means of distributing resources. And, Adam Smith would say the best means, but other people might argue that a mixed economy. Well, we've never really lived under pure capitalism. We've never lived with free markets, either in the 19th century when everyone was espousing free markets. In truth, America's massive industrial expansion was largely due to protectionism and so on. And there's always, there's always a lot of shenanigans and backroom dealing and monopolies and monosities, I think are they called? Anyway, the point is, it's always much messier when you get under the bonnet than when you read the theory. But the idea that markets had an important part to play in allocating resources and making things run smoothly, that was defended. And I suppose to some extent, if you think of Radio 4 comedy as being one of those things which is perceived, I think probably correctly, to have a left liberal bias, to some extent it was challenging that, but it wasn't kind of challenging anything to do with, I don't know, feminism or gay rights or anything like that. It didn't have any kind of right-wing perspective on any of those issues. It was simply saying that, for instance, the futures market is not simply a question of people like extracting value from the world of commodities without them having put anything in. It's actually quite a good way of enabling miners and farmers and so on to decide what to grow and dig for next year.
Well, so you mentioned that it was a bit challenging working at the BBC, having this kind of outlook. And I know that about 5 years ago, you seemed to defend the BBC against this idea that there was too much of a left-wing bias. And then over time, you kind of hardened a bit. Less accepting.
Yes, I mean, that's true. Yeah, I did. I remember going on the Trigonometry podcast. That might be one of the things you're referencing. Probably was about 5 or 6 years ago. And my sense was, yes, the BBC was a bit of a left-wing bias, but I didn't feel that there was any collusion or any conspiracy. I didn't think it was any kind of concerted effort it was not like a long march through the institutions kind of thing. I just felt that the kind of people who ended up working at the BBC, and especially as producers and commissioners and so on, were largely drawn from the humanities departments in universities, which were in themselves already demonstrating quite significant left-wing bias. We all know that, like, if you look at the faculty in America or all British universities now, in the humanities departments, the ratio is something like 20-1, right, of the professors and so on in terms of their political persuasion. So those people are likely to emerge with, those kind of sympathies. A couple of things did kind of rile me up and make me wonder whether maybe the BBC did need to take into account a little bit more than I'd done previously. One was when I know that they were accused of never booking right-wing comics for, like, Have I Got News for You and that sort of thing. And a person at the BBC said, and was quoted in The Guardian as saying, honestly, we would love to book any right-wing comedians, but there just aren't any. This is why Jeff Norcott and Simon Evans are never off the telly. And I hadn't actually ever been invited to do Have I Got News for You. I'd done Mock the Week once, like in 2011, and that's finished now. So I'd done that once. I'm quite happy to be sort of broadly categorized as a right-wing comic, but I'm certainly not hard right. I'm centre right, but I'm capable of taking the piss out of the Tories as well. So I think I would have been a fair game. And as I say, with comedy shows on the radio under my own name. I think my profile should have been high enough for them to think, well, maybe we offer Simon Evans a go, you know. But even then, I'm not saying I had a right to appear on those shows. I'm just saying that they tried to present me as somebody who had been an unwitting beneficiary of this otherwise kind of, you know, lack of available right-wing comics. And I hadn't. They just had never, I haven't done anything. I haven't been on the telly since 2014, I think. So that did kind of annoy me a bit. You know, I just thought, I'm sorry, but you're claiming a kind of, you know, my hands are tied, and they're not tied. You're refusing to use them.
In terms of being back on the BBC, have you since then, or is that bridge been burned?
Yeah, no, I wouldn't know whether it's burned or not. I don't know even that I'm necessarily very good on TV. I mean, people might tell me exactly why I don't get on there. I don't know. I've done Question Time twice and The Big Questions twice, Nicky Campbell's debate thing, and then I've done Celebrity Mastermind and a couple of Christmas University challenges. You know, maybe that's more my comfort zone. I don't know. I do understand to some extent. I mean, as I say, I made this whole show about it, and I've written about it as well. Part of the problem they have on the panel games is that if you've got like 6 panelists who are all broadly speaking aligned politically, they can banter quite productively, you know, and they can build up scenarios, and the jokes kind of they like thread together quite nicely, you know. Whereas if you throw in one spanner into those works, a guy is going, well, hang on, I don't think that's fair. Well, that's, you know, it's going to just tiresome, isn't it? Which is one of the nice things about headliners, to be honest, being on GB News, because there I host, we have 2 comedians, and sometimes they're 2 left-wing comedians, but still it's not like I'm not one surrounded by a pack of left-wingers, you know. There's maybe 2 to 1, sometimes 2 to 1 for right, 2 to 1 for the left, and just occasionally there might be 3 right-wingers. But even then, I don't think we get out of control in terms of, you know, we haven't had any beer hall putches or anything so far. It's just the sense that you can banter with people who naturally share some of your assumptions, and that makes it easier. So I do understand why it happens. But I think the BBC do have to be very careful, because they are, you know, always struggling now to justify and demonstrate that, you know, their right to be publicly funded. And if they're not really representing half the population, then that becomes suspect.
You mentioned the long march to the institutions, and there's been a lot of discussion lately that institutions have been captured by these sort of, like, I can test that these are left-wing ideologies. Like, I mean, there's this like race essentialism and stuff like that.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, that is a right wing, you know, the idea of like the Volk and so on. I mean, these were right wing, or at least adopted famously by right wing ideologists, right? So this is ideologues. So this is something that I absolutely disavow as a left-wing thing, as left-wing person myself. Anyways, people claim that these institutions have been captured. Do you think that's true?
Well, I mean, again, the left-wing, right-wing distinction there is interesting. And I think, and certainly, I mean, I expect you're talking about, you know, the Nazis, obviously, who I totally accept, you know, the fact that the word socialism appears in their name shouldn't be taken at face value. But what they certainly were was collectivist. And I think what is a danger is in institutions is when they become captured by collectivists of any kind, because then